In my most recent kit bashing video, I tackled all 13 great companies of the Space Wolves, and a few of you asked me how I went about painting that classic light blue armor of the chapter. Well, in this video, I'll be showing you exactly how I painted my Marines. I began the process with a primer, which allows the subsequent layers of paint to properly adhere to the surface. I also took advantage of this step to create a good starting colour for my blue armour, and decided upon the Colourforge's Wolfkin Grey Primer. This range of primers are my personal favourite, and this Wolfkin Grey is colour matched to Games Workshop's The Fang. You may also notice that I part assembled my Marine, keeping the head, shoulder pads and backpack separate. This isn't entirely necessary, but I find it makes painting some of those hard to reach areas much easier. The Wolfkin Grey was just the starting point though, and its darker blue colouring would create the shadows in my Space Wolf's armour, and to add those lighter blues I decided to use some dry brushing. You could use an airbrush for this too, but considering not everyone has access to one, dry brushing is a little bit more accessible and just as effective. I began this process by applying a thin line of Wolf Grey from the Tooth and Coats range to my texture palette. I then took my brush, this is one from the Arctic Opus range, dampened it ever so slightly, and lightly dipped it into the paint. From here, I worked the paint through the bristles using a circular motion on the palette, adding more paint where necessary. With the bristles evenly coated, I then applied a combination of tight circular strokes and a stippling motion to apply the paint to the armour. The paint slowly left the brush as I did so, which resulted in the gradual formation of gradients between the primer and the Wolf Grey. By focusing the application to the upper areas, I also helped to start the effect of the inner areas of the model being cast in shadow. This effect was then further enhanced with a second dry brush of the even lighter bluish grey of Gravestone Blue. Again, I repeated the same steps as before, but focused my application to a smaller area than before, targeting the paint to the points that would be hit with the most natural light. These steps combined to give me a good starting colour for the armour, whilst also creating shading. It was at this stage that I could begin applying all the base coats to the model. For each of these, I opted to mix my paint with a little water to create a thinner, less viscous paint. After applying the first layer, it was allowed to dry before applying at least one more. This left me with a good solid starting point with an even coverage. For the first of these base coats, I carefully tackled all of the steel details of the model, which range from the blades of the weaponry, the details on the armour, and the vents on the power pack. For all of these, I used some Surcoat Silver. The metallics were continued into the next step, where I painted all of the gold details with some Dragon's Gold, building up the paint over a couple of layers. After finishing this step, I would highly recommend completely changing out your paint water, as you don't want to have those metallic flakes getting into those subsequent base coats. Moving on from the metallics, I then tackled the segmented sections between the armour, the pipes and the remaining parts of the weaponry using some Death Reaper. The leather details like the belt, pouches and necklaces were then given a base coat of Scorched Earth, before I picked out the bones and teeth using some Dragon Fang. For the fur details, I used a lighter brown of Dust Bowl. To paint any rocks on the base or any runes scattered across the model, I applied a base coat of Wizard Grey, before tackling the wrapping around any weapon handles with Royal Cloak. From here, I could focus on the shoulder pads. Now, depending on what unit type you're painting, these will be different. For Wolf Scouts, it's black on the base armor colour. Grey Hunters are black on red. For Wolf Guard, it's black on yellow, and for the Blood Claws, it's red on yellow. For this particular model, I opted to use Blood Claw markings, and so opted to paint the right shoulder pad and right knee pad with a base coat of Dark Sun Yellow. Also, because this model was marked up as a black main, his left shoulder pad was also painted yellow. Now, while the coverage of this paint is good, over a blue base coat you may find that 3 or 4 thin coats will result in a far more pleasing result. To paint on those markings, I used some Sanguine Scarlet, but if this was a Wolf Guard, these markings would have been applied with Death Reaper instead, and if it was a Grey Hunter, the shoulder pad's base colour would be Sanguine Scarlet as well. Applying these markings is quite straightforward. Simply thin out your paint as normal and apply 3 evenly spaced dots to where you want the points to be. Then apply some straight diagonal lines to create the outline before filling in the shape and cleaning up the edges. Once all of my base coats had been applied, I could begin the process of lifting out the details using a combination of washes to create shading in the recesses and highlights to emphasize the raised details. The first wash was created from the Sigil Brown contrast paint, which I proceeded to heavily thin, creating a mixture that more easily flowed into the recesses. This mix was then directly and carefully targeted into those recesses of the armor, the gold details, the leather details, and the fur. As the wash pooled into those recesses, it helped to create the appearance of shadows to bring out the surrounding details. For the silver details of the model, I did the same thing, but using some of the Oblivion black wash instead. With the washes complete, I then moved on to the edge highlights. These involved using a lighter paint than the base coat to line the edges and pick out the details. The lighter or brighter paint allowed these points to stand out much more effectively. The first of these highlights saw me use some wolf grey across the ridges of the armor. The single highlight is usually enough, but if you're wanting to push them that little bit further, you can usually mix in a little bit of white paint into your original color to create an even lighter mix. This can then be applied to just the corners or sharper details, further enhancing them. For the steel details, I simply used some mithril blade, followed by glistening gold over the more decorative areas. Again, make sure you swap out your paint water after this step. Any areas painted with Death Reaper were picked out with Wizard Grey, before I applied some Ancient Forest across the leather straps and pouches. For the bone details, I added some small dots of Ivory Tusk, which I then followed up with some Temple Stone that I used to pick out the strands of wolf fur. For the edges of the stones, I used Cock Harridan Grey, and used the pinky purple of Sword Hilt Burgundy for the handle wraps of the weaponry. When it came to picking out the shoulder pads, I had to return to a little more freehand work in order to add some highlights to those shoulder pad details. For the yellow areas, I used some yellow flame, before using some demon red across the details I'd painted with Sanguine Scarlet. For the head, I like to approach things a little differently. The face is often a focal point of a model, and so by taking a little more time on this one area, you can easily take it to that next level. So to create the fiery red hair, I began with some Phonetic Orange. This was washed with Hellion Red to add a little shading, whilst also preserving the orange coloration. To pick out the lines of the hair, I then used some of the even brighter Orange Flare. To paint the skin itself, I began with Barbarian Brawn. While the base coat was pretty straightforward, the next couple of steps required a little more focus. I first took some Dwarven skin, lightly thinned it out with water, and then carefully painted this across the face, leaving the recesses as the darker Barbarian Brawn. The trick here is to hardly apply any paint at all with your layers and build up the application slowly. This allows you to build a smoother finish and softer gradients between the dark and light details. Speaking of details, the most prominent facial features were then highlighted using some elven skin. However, like before, these highlights were built up steadily using some thinned paint. Once complete, you should be left with a much more realistic looking skin. With the model complete, my attention shifted to the base, where I applied some of AK Interactive's Dark Earth texture paste. When you're applying this, just make sure that you don't spill over onto the model itself. To create the appearance of frozen ground, after allowing it to dry fully, I lightly dry brushed the surface using some Cock Harridan Grey. For the snow, I decided to use some Frostine Blizzard from Siege Scenics range, and to create that snowy effect, I mixed it into some AK Interactive's clear water. This resulted in a paste that I could adjust the viscosity of by changing the amount of Frostine Blizzard that I'd mixed in. The snowy paste was then applied in rough patches across the frozen ground with a few variations in thickness to achieve a more realistic looking, partly melted snow effect. You can also sprinkle on a little of the dry Frostine Blizzard to the still wet paste to give it more of a powder snow effect. From here, all that was left to do was to clean up the rim of the base, which I did with a flat black marker, also from AK Interactive, before assembling and varnishing the model, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Space Wolf, painted in their classic colours. Now, if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my previous video where I created a unique kit bash for each of the 13 great companies to reflect their personalities and preferred methods of warfare. I'll include a link to that on screen now and in the description below. Now, the especially observant among you may have noticed that the extra raven feathers that I'd added to this Blood Claws belt, and those came from my very own Dead Animal Bits kit. If you're interested in picking up a box for yourself and you're in the UK or the US, then check out my website, www.sparepartsemporium.com, and if you're in the EU or other parts of the world, then you can find them on the Wargames Atlantic web store as well. And before I go, let me just say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button, just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Adrian Ruiz, Ban Yevrian, Berserker, Dakota Gaburi, Daniel Dowling, George Conzini Roberts, Immaterial Creations, Cornbread, Little Templar, Matt Chasevitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Older Than Time, Sam Sepulveda, Swedsman, and Tim. And my top channel members who are Alex Verne, Bon Johnson, Daniel Reese, Dave, Doug H, Guy Bazant, Lee Ely, Mark Taylor, Misa Pogon, Nerdington Paints, Omnitom, Philip Poya, S.O., Satoran, S.J. Carper, That One Tech Priest, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.